What would you do if your entire life of privilege was stripped away in a single breath, if the wealth you'd always taken for granted suddenly hung by a thread, and the only way to keep it was to live as an ordinary man, doing ordinary work, for the very first time? This is the story of Jonathan Whitmore, the only son of one of Boston's richest men, a man who had everything, yet had never earned anything. When his father delivers a ruthless ultimatum, 30 days to prove his worth, or lose the family fortune forever, Jonathan is thrown into a world he's never known, a world of time clocks, worn-out shoes, and co-workers who measure respect not by a name, but by effort. And then there's Claire Bennett, strong, intelligent, unshakably honest. She doesn't care about Jonathan's last name, and she certainly isn't impressed by his past. But could she become the one person who teaches him the meaning of integrity, and maybe even the possibility of love? Will Jonathan rise from spoiled heir to a man worth respecting, or lose everything, including the woman who might change his life forever? If this story touches you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Now let's begin. Jonathan Whitmore had grown up in a world where the carpets were thick enough to swallow sound, where every wall gleamed with oil paintings older than the nation itself, and where men in dark suits hovered in corners, waiting to open doors that he never touched. At 32, he still lived in the penthouse above Beacon Hill, overlooking the city of Boston like a prince surveying a kingdom. The skyline sparkled beneath him at night, yet it all felt strangely hollow, like glitter on broken glass. His father, Edward Whitmore, had built that kingdom. A self-made tycoon, Edward had turned a single shipping contract into an empire that spanned logistics, finance, and real estate. His name carried weight in every boardroom from New York to Los Angeles. But to Jonathan, that name had always felt like a chain. He wore it on his shoulders, heavy and suffocating, and no matter how fine his suits or how polished his charm, he could never quite convince Edward he was more than a disappointment. On a gray February morning, father and son faced each other across the vast mahogany desk in the Whitmore estate. The air smelled faintly of leather and old cigars. Outside, snow flurries danced against the tall windows, but inside the room was all sharp edges and cold silence. Edward's voice finally broke through, low, clipped, carrying the authority of decades of command. "Jonathan, I have given you every advantage a man could ask for. Education at Harvard, travel across Europe, a trust fund large enough to keep you comfortable for several lifetimes. And yet what have you done with it?" Jonathan shifted in his chair, his silk tie suddenly choking him. "I've invested, father. I've managed portfolios. I've..." Edward's hand cut through the air, silencing him. "You've squandered. You've played at investments the way a child plays with toy soldiers. You drift from one venture to another, never seeing anything through. Your name appears in gossip columns more often than in financial reports. At 32, you stand for nothing. You've built nothing. You are nothing." The words sliced through Jonathan like ice water. He wanted to argue, to remind his father of the deals he had closed, the charities he had donated to, the parties where he had shaken the right hands. But beneath his anger was the gnawing truth, none of it amounted to much. He had lived in the shadow of Whitmore wealth, mistaking its glow for his own. Edward leaned forward, his gray eyes sharp as steel. "So here is what will happen. You have exactly 30 days, 30, not a day more, to prove you can live as a man, not as a parasite. You will step out of this house, out of this penthouse life, and into the world as an ordinary citizen. You will work, you will earn, you will stand on your own feet. If, by the end of those 30 days, you cannot show me that you understand what it means to live by your own effort." He paused, letting the silence stretch like a blade before lowering it with finality. "Then every cent of your inheritance will be transferred into the Whitmore Foundation. Charity will do more good with it than you ever have." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You can't be serious." "I have never been more serious in my life," Edward said. "You may think this is cruelty. It is not. It is mercy. If you fail, At least the world will benefit from what I have built. And if you succeed, perhaps I will finally have a son I can respect." Jonathan rose from his chair, heat flooding his face. "You're ashamed of me. Is that it? After all these years? After everything I've tried?" Edward's gaze was unwavering. "Ashamed? Yes. Because you have mistaken privilege for achievement. Because you confuse charm for character. Because you live as though the world owes you comfort when in truth you've earned nothing." Jonathan's throat tightened. He wanted to shout, to slam his fist against the desk, to walk out and never return. Yet beneath the fury was a deeper ache, the small, wounded part of him that still longed for his father's approval, still craved a word of pride that had never come. He lowered his eyes to the Persian rug, searching for words and finding none. 30 days. It sounded absurd, impossible. What could he possibly prove in so little time? And yet, he knew Edward well enough to recognize there would be no appeal, no compromise. Edward reached into a drawer and slid an envelope across the desk. "Inside, you'll find the details. Tomorrow morning, you will report to one of Whitmore Enterprises' smaller divisions. No boardrooms, no trust funds, no driver to open the door for you. You will be treated as any other new hire. No one will know who you are, unless you choose to betray yourself." Jonathan stared at the envelope, his stomach twisting. "And if I walk away, then you will walk away from everything. The penthouse, the cars, the accounts, all of it." Silence pressed in on the room. The snow outside thickened, whitening the city beyond the glass. For the first time in his life, Jonathan felt the full weight of what it meant to stand on the edge of ruin, not financial ruin, for that was his father's threat, but the ruin of identity. Who was he without the Whitmore name, without the money that paved every road ahead of him? Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression a mask carved from granite. "The choice is yours, but remember this: 30 days can make or break a man. We will see what kind of man you are." Jonathan clenched the envelope in his hand, the paper stiff against his palm. He wanted to tear it apart, to throw it back at his father. Instead, he slipped it into his jacket pocket. His voice, when it finally came, was a whisper edged with defiance. "Fine, 30 days, but don't expect me to thank you when this circus is over." Edward did not flinch. "I expect nothing but truth. Jonathan, for once in your life, show me you can earn something real." The conversation ended there. Jonathan left the study, his footsteps echoing in the long marble hallway, the chandeliers above throwing fractured light across his face. Outside the estate, the snow had begun to settle on the city streets, blanketing Boston in a silence that felt almost merciful. Yet within Jonathan's chest, there was no mercy, only turmoil. Anger at his father, humiliation at his own inadequacies, and, beneath it all, a trembling spark of fear. For the first time in 32 years, the world would not bow to his name, and he had no idea whether he could survive it. As he stepped into the night, the envelope pressed against his chest like a ticking clock. 30 days. 30 days to prove he was more than a wealthy man's son. 30 days to find a life he had never known. The snow crunched under his shoes, and the city of Boston stretched out before him cold, vast, and utterly indifferent. Jonathan Whitmore had always imagined work as something that happened in glass towers, under chandeliers, with polished marble echoing the click of expensive shoes. So when he arrived the next morning at a squat brick building on the edge of South Boston's industrial district, he felt as though he'd been sent into exile. The sign above the entrance read, "Whitmore Services Division," 3 words that sounded harmless, even dull. But Jonathan already sensed this was the beginning of his 30-day ordeal. The inside of the building smelled faintly of coffee, printer toner, and cleaning supplies. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Cubicles lined the floor like gray boxes, each with stacks of papers and half-drained mugs. Men and women in simple business attire moved briskly between desks, carrying clipboards, answering phones, tapping away at keyboards. This was not the Whitmore empire of high finance and international deals. This was the machinery that kept the world turning, unnoticed and unglamorous. Jonathan tugged at the collar of his shirt, suddenly aware that his tailored jacket looked out of place here. He felt like an overdressed stranger at a family dinner. He was directed by the receptionist to the third floor, where the branch office of Human Resources and Logistics operated. At the end of the hallway, a door bore a modest plaque, Branch Manager, Claire Bennett. He knocked once, then entered at the sharp invitation of a woman's voice. Behind the desk sat Claire Bennett. She was 35, though the calm authority in her presence made her seem older, steadier. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a neat bun, though a loose strand framed her face. Her blouse was simple, her blazer practical, yet she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who neither sought attention nor allowed it to slip past her unnoticed. Jonathan had expected another gray bureaucrat, but her eyes caught him off guard. They were a deep hazel, intelligent and steady, the kind of eyes that had seen hardship and learned not just to endure it, but to draw strength from it. She glanced at the file in front of her before looking up. Mr. Whitmore, our new administrative assistant. The word struck him like a slap. He had never been called that before assistant. He had been heir, investor, socialite, even playboy, but never assistant. Yes, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. That's me. Good. Punctuality is the first test you've passed. Her tone was neither warm nor cruel, it was simply factual, like a teacher noting attendance. Let me be clear. Mr. Whitmore, in this office, I don't care about where you went to school, or who your family is, or what you think you're entitled to. What I care about is work. Can you handle that? Jonathan swallowed hard. For a moment, he wanted to blurt out his truth that he was no ordinary hire, that his last name could buy this building 10 times over, but he heard his father's voice echoing, "No one will know who you are unless you choose to betray yourself." "I can handle it," he said. The words tasted strange, like trying on shoes that didn't fit yet. Claire studied him, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "We'll see." She handed him a small stack of papers, forms to file, messages to transcribe, schedules to organize, menial tasks he had always left to others. "Your desk is outside, near the copier," she said. "Phone extension 214. You'll be answering calls, sorting requests, making coffee runs, and filing reports. Nothing glamorous, but everything important." Jonathan nodded, clutching the stack like it might bite him. "Yes, ma'am." Claire raised one eyebrow. "Don't ma'am me, Mr. Whitmore. I work for a living, not a title." "Claire will do." The rest of the day unfolded like a series of humiliations. The copier jammed 3 times under his hands. He spilled coffee across a stack of invoices. He dropped a box of paper clips that scattered like metallic raindrops across the floor. Each mistake drew chuckles from nearby co-workers, though not cruel ones, more the bemused laughter of veterans watching a rookie stumble. From her office, Claire observed him. She said little, but when she did speak, her words carried weight. "Double check before you file. Answer the phone with a smile, even if they can't see it. Coffee orders go in alphabetical order, it saves time." Jonathan obeyed, his pride shrinking with each correction. He had thought this assignment would be tedious. He had not expected it to feel like drowning. By mid-afternoon, his shoulders ached from leaning over filing cabinets, his ears rang from the constant buzz of phones, and his head throbbed from fluorescent light. He glanced through the office window at the city skyline he had once looked down upon from his penthouse. Now, the city loomed above him. At 5 o'clock, Claire dismissed the staff with a nod. Some gathered their coats quickly, eager to catch trains or buses home. Others lingered, chatting about dinner plans or weekend errands. Jonathan packed his things slowly, unsure if he was expected to stay longer. Claire stepped out of her office, a folder in her arms. She stopped by his desk. "Rough first day." He tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "You could say that." Her expression softened just slightly. "It gets easier, if you let it." Jonathan looked at her, puzzled. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I was 22, she said matter-of-factly. "Our parents died in a car accident. My sister was still in high school. I took the first job I could find, worked my way up, one rung at a time, no shortcuts. Her voice was calm, without bitterness, but Jonathan heard the weight behind her words. Sacrifice, responsibility, a life of steady toil that he had never known. For a moment, neither spoke. The office around them had grown quiet, the hum of computers fading as screens went dark. Claire shifted the folder under her arm and gave him a final look. If you last 30 days here, Mr. Whitmore, it won't be because of your name, it'll be because you've earned it. Don't forget that. Jonathan felt the words settle in his chest, heavy as stone. 30 days. He thought of the envelope still in his pocket, of his father's unyielding face. And for the first time, he wondered not just if he could do this, but who he might be if he actually tried. As he walked out into the evening air, the city lights glimmered against the harbor. Once, he had seen them as jewels, sparkling treasures that belonged to him by birthright. Now, they looked different, like distant stars, bright but unreachable, demanding something he didn't yet know how to give. The second morning began with the faint hope that perhaps yesterday had been a nightmare. Jonathan woke in the small apartment his father had arranged near the office, nothing like the penthouse he'd known all his life. The wallpaper peeled at the corners. The heater rattled like an old man coughing. His bed was narrow, his sheets thin. He dressed in plain slacks and a button-down shirt bought from a department store. The clothes felt foreign, cheap against his skin, but they blended better with his co-workers. The penthouse wardrobe of Armani and tailored wool had no place here. He caught his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. At the office, the day began in a rush. Phones rang, printers whirred, conversations floated across cubicles. Claire handed him a list of tasks with the efficiency of a surgeon laying out instruments. First, make 10 copies of this contract packet. Then, clear the conference table. There's dust from last night's meeting. After that, coffee for the senior staff. Cream and sugar preferences are on the list. Don't mix them up. Jonathan forced a smile. Understood. The copier, however, seemed to have declared war. He fed the papers in, pressed the button, and listened to the machine groan before it spat out crumpled sheets like chewed gum. He tugged at the jam tray, his tie catching in the process. When he finally freed the mangled paper, sweat beaded at his temple. A young clerk passing by chuckled. Careful, rookie, that machine eats souls. Jonathan muttered something unintelligible, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. He had once signed checks worth millions. Now he couldn't manage a copier. By the time he finished, the conference room awaited. He gathered the courage to clean it, wiping crumbs, aligning chairs, collecting abandoned coffee cups. The stale smell of last night's brew clung to his hands. He grimaced, but carried on. As he balanced a tray of cups later, heading toward the manager's desks, disaster struck. One step too quick, one tilt too far, scalding coffee sloshed over the rim, splattering across a stack of payroll reports. Gasps echoed. Jonathan froze, horrified, as the ink bled into a brown smear. Unbelievable, someone muttered nearby. He scrambled to blot the papers with napkins, his hands trembling. The more he dabbed, the worse it looked. His throat tightened, and a sharp laugh rang out across the office. Guess Harvard didn't teach you how to carry coffee, a voice teased. Jonathan looked up to see a man in his late 20s smirking, arms folded. Others snickered quietly, though not cruelly more, the way soldiers laugh when a recruit trips on his boots. Jonathan wanted to lash out, to remind them that he could buy this building 3 times over, but he bit his tongue, remembering his father's warning. Pride was a currency that carried no value here. Claire appeared at his side. She didn't raise her voice, but the disappointment in her tone cut deeper than any scolding. Mr. Whitmore, when you're carrying something fragile papers, hot drinks, people's trust, steady hands matter. Try again. Her calm authority silenced the room. Jonathan nodded, muttering an apology, and hurried back to brew another pot. His ears burned. The rest of the morning was no kinder. He misdialed extensions, stapled forms in the wrong order, and knocked over a wastebasket while squeezing between cubicles. Each mistake felt like another brick in the wall closing around him. By lunch, he sat alone at the small break table, staring at a sandwich he'd bought from the corner deli. The bread was soggy, the cheese cheap. He chewed mechanically, listening to laughter from a group of co-workers sharing stories about families, grocery runs, and weekend chores. Their world was ordinary, but it pulsed with a kind of authenticity he had never known. He thought of his usual lunches, linen tablecloths, waiters pouring sparkling water, plates that cost more than this week's groceries. The contrast was jarring. Here, food wasn't about display, it was about fuel to get through the day. Claire approached, setting her own modest salad on the table. She glanced at him, then at the untouched half of his sandwich. Not to your taste. Jonathan forced a smile. It's fine. Just different. Her gaze lingered. Different isn't always worse. Sometimes it teaches you what you've been ignoring. The word struck deeper than she intended. Jonathan nodded, unable to meet her eyes. The afternoon stretched long. Each task tested him. Each correction from Claire stung, but beneath the sting was something unfamiliar awareness. He realized how every small mistake created ripples. A wrong file delayed a meeting. A spilled coffee wasted someone's time. A missed call frustrated a client. The smallest jobs, the ones he had always overlooked, carried weight. By 5 o'clock, exhaustion pressed on his shoulders like an anchor. He gathered his papers with clumsy hands and nearly dropped them again. As he reached the door, Claire's voice stopped him. Jonathan. He turned. She stood by her office door, arms crossed. You're trying. I'll give you that. But effort without humility won't get you far. Leave your pride at home tomorrow. Bring only your willingness to learn. Jonathan nodded slowly. The words stung, but they also settled into him with an odd sense of truth. On the walk back to his apartment, the city lights blurred through his tired eyes. He felt both smaller and strangely more awake than he had in years. For the first time, he saw clearly the chasm between the life he had lived and the life most people endured every single day. He wasn't sure he could cross it, but now, he wasn't sure he could ignore it either. The following morning, Jonathan arrived earlier than usual. A restless night in the drafty apartment had left him groggy, but he refused to stumble in late again. The receptionist glanced up in surprise as he walked in carrying a plain cup of coffee he'd bought from a street vendor. No latte art, no imported beans, just hot, bitter fuel. When he reached his desk, Claire was already waiting. She held a clipboard with a list of assignments, but instead of handing him routine office tasks, she gave a small nod toward the back hallway. Today you'll be in the archives. Jonathan frowned. The archives. Her lips curved into something between amusement and warning. Basement storage. Decades of records, boxes stacked to the ceiling. It needs cleaning and organizing. You'll start there. His stomach sank. He had imagined clerical work paperwork, phones, even endless copying, but cleaning a dusty basement felt like punishment. All day, as long as it takes, Claire said simply. Take gloves, and don't come back up until you've made progress. I can measure. The hallway led to a heavy steel door. Jonathan tugged it open, and a draft of stale air met him. He descended the narrow staircase, the light dimming with each step. At the bottom lay a cavernous room filled with metal shelves bowing under the weight of file boxes. Dust motes floated in beams of weak light from a single window high above. The air was thick, dry, musty, tinged with something that reminded him of forgotten attics. He coughed, already regretting every decision that had led him here. There was no glamour, no prestige, just cardboard and dust. He picked up the nearest box, only to stagger as its weight surprised him. Old ledgers thudded inside, each page swollen with age. He set it on a table, his arms trembling. Sweat broke out across his forehead, though the room was cool. He began with the shelves closest to the stairs, hauling boxes down, wiping the surfaces, stacking them in labeled order. Within minutes, his crisp shirt clung to his back. Dust clung to his hair and eyebrows. His hands, unaccustomed to rough cardboard edges, reddened quickly. By the third box, his palms stung. Hours passed in a haze of lifting, wiping, coughing. The air was dry enough to parch his throat. Sweat trickled down his temple, cutting lines through the dust on his skin. His shoulders ached from reaching. His knees throbbed from crouching. For the first time in his life, Jonathan felt the raw edge of physical exhaustion, the kind that no luxury spa or personal trainer had ever prepared him for. This wasn't exercise. This wasn't leisure disguised as work. This was labor, plain and unrelenting. Around midday, he sank onto a crate, chest heaving. His hands were blistered, small bubbles rising where skin had rubbed against cardboard. He flexed his fingers, wincing at the pain. Never had he thought paper could wound him. Above, the stairwell door creaked. Claire appeared, descending carefully in sensible shoes. She paused at the bottom, her gaze sweeping the room. Jonathan rose quickly, embarrassed by the sight. He must have made shirt untucked, face streaked with grime, hair damp with sweat. "Well?" she asked. He gestured toward the nearest rows. "I've cleared 3 shelves, grouped by year, labeled on the spines." The dust was thick. It's slow going. Claire stepped closer, brushing a finger along a freshly cleaned shelf. It came away almost spotless. She nodded once. "Better than I expected." The faintest flicker of pride sparked in Jonathan's chest, but her next words smothered it. "Don't mistake this for praise. You've only started. Real progress takes time and endurance." He bit back a retort, knowing it would only expose his bruised pride. Instead, he straightened his aching back and said, "I'll keep going." She studied him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Jonathan thought he saw something softer in her eyes, not sympathy exactly, but a quiet hope, as though she wanted him to last, to prove himself, even if she doubted he could. Without another word, she turned and climbed back up the stairs, the door closing behind her with a hollow thud. Jonathan exhaled slowly, alone again. He lifted another box. His arms screamed, but he forced himself onward. By late afternoon, his world had shrunk to the rhythm of lifting, wiping, stacking. Muscles burned he hadn't known he possessed. His dress shoes pinched, leaving raw spots at his heels. The once pristine shirt bore stains of sweat and dust that no dry cleaner could erase. When he finally emerged from the basement, the fluorescent lights of the office seemed blinding. Co-workers glanced up, startled by his appearance. One whispered something that drew muffled laughter, but Jonathan ignored them. He set the clipboard on Claire's desk, his hands trembling from fatigue. She looked up from her computer, eyes sweeping over his disheveled state. "Long day, longest of my life," Jonathan admitted, voice rough. Her lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her. "That means it was useful." He wanted to argue, but found he couldn't. Beneath the exhaustion was something else, something unfamiliar but undeniable, the faintest sense of accomplishment. The shelves behind him stood cleaner, clearer, more orderly because of his hands. No one else would care, but he knew. And for the first time, Jonathan began to understand that humility wasn't just about swallowing pride, it was about discovering worth in places he'd never thought to look. The following week settled into a rhythm. Jonathan arrived each morning with sore hands and stiff shoulders, but he no longer lingered at the door like a condemned man. Instead, he headed straight to his tasks, filing, sorting, copying, answering phones with a quiet determination. He still stumbled, still drew a few chuckles from coworkers, but there was less mockery now. Some even offered small tips, guiding him with a patience that surprised him. And always, there was Claire. She moved through the office with steady grace, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor, her clipboard tucked under one arm like an extension of herself. She was efficient, exacting, but not cruel. Every correction she gave Jonathan was sharp, but it carried the weight of fairness, never spite. One evening, after most of the staff had left, Jonathan found himself lingering at his desk, trying to finish a stack of forms Claire had asked him to organize. The office had grown quiet, the hum of machines fading into silence. He rubbed his eyes, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light. A voice broke the stillness. "You should call it a night, Jonathan. Those forms will still be here tomorrow." He looked up. Claire stood in her doorway, her blazer draped over one arm. Without the sharp outline of professional attire, she seemed somehow softer, more human. "I just wanted to finish," Jonathan said, his voice rough from fatigue. Claire walked over, setting her blazer on a chair. She glanced at the messy stack of papers, then at his blistered hands. "You're not used to this kind of work, are you?" Jonathan hesitated. The truth hovered on his tongue that he had never done a day of it in his life, that servants and assistants had always shielded him from these menial tasks. But he only said, "Not exactly." Claire leaned against the desk, arms folded. For a moment, her eyes drifted, unfocused, as though she were looking backward in time. "I wasn't either. Once. My parents died in a car crash when I was 22. One phone call, and everything I thought I knew about life ended." Jonathan's breath caught. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to share something so personal. She continued quietly, her voice steady but tinged with memory. "My sister, Lily, was 17, still in high school. She had college dreams, but no money to get there. I dropped out of my own classes, took the first job I could find typing, filing, errands, anything to keep a roof over our heads. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival." Her hazel eyes flicked to Jonathan's, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw a deep, quiet sorrow there. But it wasn't the sorrow of weakness, it was the sorrow of sacrifice, worn like a badge of honor. Jonathan swallowed hard. That must have been impossible. Claire shook her head gently. "Not impossible. Just necessary. That's the thing most people don't understand about work. It's not about pride or punishment. It's about doing what has to be done because someone is counting on you." Jonathan sat in silence, her words echoing in his chest. He thought of his own life, lavish parties, careless spending, meaningless deals. Who had ever truly counted on him? What had he ever done because it was necessary, not convenient? For the first time, he felt ashamed not in front of his father, not under Claire's stern gaze, but within himself. "I admire that," he said quietly. "The way you stepped up, most people, I don't think they could." Claire gave a small smile, tired but genuine. "You'd be surprised what people can do when they don't have a choice." Jonathan studied her face, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the resolute set of her mouth. She carried the weight of years, of responsibilities that had forged her into steel. Yet there was something else, too, beneath the strength. He sensed a loneliness, a longing she kept buried under layers of professionalism. He wanted to ask more, to know more, but the words tangled in his throat. He settled for a simple, "Thank you for telling me." Claire straightened, slipping her blazer back over her shoulders. "Don't thank me. Just learn something from it. Life isn't about what you're handed. It's about what you carry, and how far you carry it." She turned toward her office, but paused at the doorway. "Go home, Jonathan. Rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." As she disappeared inside, Jonathan sat frozen, staring at the empty desk in front of him. For the first time in his life, he felt he had glimpsed true value in another person, value that had nothing to do with wealth or status, but with strength carved from hardship, compassion born from responsibility. Walking home that night, the city streets felt different. The honking cars, the flicker of neon signs, the laughter spilling from bars, all of it seemed sharper, more vivid, as though he were seeing it with new eyes. He thought of Claire's story, of the quiet resilience etched into her every movement. For so long, he had believed value came with a price tag. Tonight, he began to understand it was measured in sacrifice, in endurance, in love given without guarantee of return, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain. He found himself looking forward to tomorrow not for his father's approval, not for the inheritance, but for the chance to step into Claire's office again, to hear her voice, to learn what real strength looked like. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm Jonathan had never known before. His mornings no longer began with the sound of valet doors closing behind him or a personal chef serving breakfast on china. Instead, he rose before sunrise in the small, drafty apartment, made coffee from a tin of grounds that left grit at the bottom of the cup, and walked to the office with the hum of the city waking around him. Something unexpected had begun to stir in him. Where once he would have dragged his feet, now he hurried to his desk. He still stumbled misplacing files, misdialing phones, but each mistake taught him something. He no longer dismissed the work as beneath him. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he started to respect it. The change did not go unnoticed. On a chilly Tuesday morning, Jonathan passed the break room just as Maria, a clerk in her 60s, struggled with a heavy box of archived reports. Her thin arms trembled under the weight, and she paused to catch her breath. Instinctively, Jonathan rushed forward. "Let me take that," he said. She tried to protest, but relief crossed her face as she allowed him to lift the box. It was heavier than he expected, pressing into his chest as he carried it to her desk. "Thank you," Maria said, her voice warm and genuine. "My back isn't what it used to be. You saved me there." Jonathan set the box down carefully, his palms stinging from the weight. Her gratitude washed over him in a way that startled him. For the first time, thanks felt different, earned, not purchased. He wasn't being flattered because of his last name or bank account. He had simply been useful. Walking back to his desk, Jonathan felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years' pride. Not the hollow pride of closing a deal his father's name had secured, nor the fleeting pride of being the center of attention at a gala. This was smaller, quieter, but infinitely more real. That afternoon, a few co-workers offered him nods of acknowledgement. One even clapped him lightly on the shoulder as he passed. The gesture was simple, but it carried weight. He was no longer a complete outsider. Claire, however, remained the same. She still corrected him when he misfiled reports, still pointed out when his phone manners faltered, but occasionally when he finished a task ahead of schedule, or when he offered to help a colleague, she allowed the smallest shift in expression. Her eyes softened, or the corners of her mouth lifted in a restrained, almost smile. Jonathan noticed every flicker. He told himself not to care, but he did. Each tiny sign of her approval lit something inside him. By the end of the week, Jonathan found himself staying later than required, organizing supply shelves or double-checking schedules. He began keeping a notebook where he wrote down reminders, names of co-workers, details about tasks, even shorthand about mistakes to avoid. It wasn't just survival anymore. He wanted to improve. One evening, as the office emptied, Jonathan stayed behind to straighten a pile of mislabeled forms. He barely noticed Claire walking up until her shadow fell across the desk. "You're still here," she said. He looked up, startled. "I wanted to fix this filing system. It was slowing everyone down." Claire studied him for a long moment, her hazel eyes searching. "You didn't have to." "I know," Jonathan said quietly, "but I wanted to." Something flickered across her face, a mix of surprise and something else, harder to define. She gave a short nod. "Good. Keep it up." She turned to leave, but Jonathan caught the faintest trace of approval in her tone. It was enough to keep him awake half the night, replaying the moment in his mind. As the days turned into another week, Jonathan realized how much his world had shrunk and yet how much fuller it felt. The work was simple, repetitive, sometimes grueling, but in its simplicity, he found clarity. Each task completed was a small victory. Each thank you from a co-worker carried more meaning than all the applause he'd once received at society parties. The transformation unsettled him. He had built his identity on wealth and image, and now both seemed to matter less with each passing day. Instead, he measured himself by the weight of a box carried, the accuracy of a file sorted, the ease of a colleague's burden lifted, and through it all, Claire remained the compass point he couldn't ignore. She was still sharp, still demanding, but every so often, when she thought no one was watching, Jonathan glimpsed something else in her, something that hinted at trust, perhaps even quiet respect. For Jonathan, those glimpses were enough. They told him he was not merely enduring this 30-day ordeal. He was changing, slowly, awkwardly, painfully, but undeniably. Walking home one evening, the city lights no longer seemed distant jewels, untouchable and cold. Instead, they shimmered like beacons, guiding him towards something he had never known. He was missing a sense of belonging. Not bought, not inherited, but earned. By the third week, Jonathan had begun to notice things others overlooked. What once felt like meaningless errands now revealed patterns, bottlenecks that slowed everyone down, routines that wasted precious minutes, systems begging for order. The archives had been his crucible. Hours of hauling boxes and reorganizing files had shown him how messy, how inefficient the storage system really was. Entire afternoons were wasted by clerks searching for a single document, wandering the aisles of dusty shelves. Jonathan had endured that frustration firsthand, sweating over stacks of mislabeled ledgers. One morning, after finishing his phone duties, he gathered the courage to step into Claire's office. She looked up from her laptop, brow arched. Her pen paused in midair. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." Jonathan swallowed, nerves prickling his skin. "I've been working in the archives, and I think there's a better way to organize it." Her pen tapped lightly against her notebook. "Go on." He unfolded a piece of paper where he had sketched a crude diagram. Right now, everything's stacked by when it was received. That means a payroll report from 5 years ago is buried between vendor contracts and supply receipts. If we resorted by category: payroll, vendor, legal, then labeled shelves by year, it would cut search time in half. Claire leaned back, studying him with a look he couldn't quite read. For a moment, Jonathan worried she might laugh, dismiss him as playing manager, but she didn't. Instead, she reached for the paper, scanning his notes with sharp eyes. "This would require relabeling nearly every box," she said. "Yes," Jonathan admitted, "but once it's done, it'll save hours every week." "I've seen how frustrated Maria and the others get digging through old files. This would help them." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Then Claire set the paper down and looked directly at him. "You actually paid attention?" Jonathan blinked. "Of course I did." "No," she said softly, shaking her head. "Most people in your position wouldn't notice. They'd do the minimum, curse the dust, and leave the mess for someone else. But you observed, and you thought about how to make it better." Heat rose in Jonathan's chest, not embarrassment, but something else. Pride, maybe, but deeper. This was not the hollow pride of wealth. This was the pride of being seen, truly seen, for effort that mattered. "Should I put together a plan?" he asked. Claire considered him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes. Show me how you'd implement it. If it works, we'll do it." For the rest of the day, Jonathan worked with an intensity that surprised even himself. He mapped the shelves, created color-coded labels, drafted a timeline for reorganizing without disrupting daily work. By evening, his desk was littered with notes and diagrams. His fingers ached from writing, but his mind buzzed with energy. The next morning, Claire reviewed his plan. She didn't smile, but her eyes held something close to it. "All right," she said. "Let's test it. You'll lead the reorganization." Jonathan's heart thudded. Lead. No one had ever trusted him with responsibility in this office. He gathered a small team, explained the system, and guided them through the first section of shelves. There were missteps. Yes, boxes misplaced, labels smudged, but by the end of the week, an entire row gleamed with neat order. Maria, the older clerk, patted Jonathan's arm. "This is wonderful. I can finally find payroll records without losing half my day. Thank you." Her gratitude was quiet but genuine, and Jonathan felt it settle inside him like a spark catching flame. That evening, as the staff filed out, Claire lingered near his desk. He was wiping dust from his hands when she spoke. "You did well." Jonathan looked up, startled. "You mean that?" She nodded. I expected you to complain. Instead, you created something useful. That earns respect. Jonathan, not your last name, not your inheritance. This. She gestured toward the neat shelves visible through the office window. For a long moment, their eyes met. Jonathan felt stripped bare, yet not in the way his father's gaze always left him feeling small. Claire's look was different. It was measuring, yes, but also acknowledging. She was seeing him not as a spoiled heir or a clumsy assistant, but as a man capable of more, and in that gaze, Jonathan felt something shift. "Thank you," he said quietly. Claire's lips curved into the faintest, almost reluctant smile. "Don't thank me yet. There's still a lot of work to do." But as she turned away, Jonathan caught a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. Walking home that night, his steps felt lighter despite the ache in his muscles. For the first time, he realized that respect wasn't handed down like an inheritance, it was earned, piece by piece, through effort, patience, and care. And as much as he wanted his father's recognition, he found himself craving Claire's respect even more. Because when she looked at him with those steady hazel eyes, he felt like more than just a Whitmore. He felt like a man becoming someone real. Friday afternoon came with the heavy, sluggish pace that offices everywhere seemed to share. Phones rang less often, papers shuffled more slowly, and even Claire's sharp heels clicked with a softer rhythm. Jonathan sat at his desk, finishing the last of the filing Claire had assigned him, when a voice startled him. "Hey, Whitmore," called Roberto, one of the maintenance staff, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a laugh that could rattle the windows. "We're heading to O'Malley's for lunch. You coming?" Jonathan blinked. No one had invited him anywhere before. He looked at Claire's door, half expecting her to appear and remind him of the workload waiting. Roberto followed his gaze, chuckling. "Don't worry. The boss eats fast. She won't mind if you're gone an hour." Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "All right." A small group gathered: Maria, the older clerk, Tommy, a young courier saving for his wedding, and Roberto, who led the way. They spilled onto the street, their chatter rising above the hum of traffic. Jonathan followed, feeling both like an intruder and oddly eager. O'Malley's turned out to be a narrow-cornered diner with vinyl booths and the smell of frying onions clinging to the air. The waitress greeted them by name, leading them to a table near the window. Jonathan slid into the booth, awkward in his button-down shirt, while the others ordered burgers and fries with the ease of regulars. When the waitress turned to him, Jonathan froze. His dining experiences had always come with menus as thick as novels and waiters reciting wine lists. Here, the choices were scrawled on a chalkboard above the counter. "I'll have what he's having," Jonathan said quickly, pointing at Roberto's plate-to-be. The table laughed, not unkindly. As plates arrived, greasy burgers wrapped in paper, fries piled high, sodas in tall glasses, conversation flowed. Maria spoke about her grandson's soccer game, how she worried about his asthma. Tommy shared his excitement about choosing a wedding venue, lamenting the cost of flowers. Roberto grumbled about his landlord raising rent again, joking that maybe he should move into the storage closet at the office. Jonathan listened, silent at first. Their stories felt so far from the circles he had lived in, where conversations revolved around stock portfolios, summer homes, and charity galas, and yet, as they laughed together, teased each other gently, and shared complaints about everyday struggles, he felt something stir in him. It was foreign, this sense of community built not on wealth but on shared burdens, shared joys. Maria noticed his quiet and nudged him. "So, Jonathan, what about you family kids?" Jonathan hesitated, the truth clawing at his throat. If he told them about the Whitmore estate, about the penthouse and trust funds, the fragile bridge of connection might collapse. Instead, he shrugged lightly. "No kids, just figuring things out." Maria nodded, accepting the answer without pressing. The burger arrived, dripping with melted cheese and grilled onions. Jonathan picked it up awkwardly, juices running down his fingers. But the first bite startled him. It was messy, imperfect, and delicious. He found himself eating faster, almost hungrily. The table roared with laughter when he reached for napkins. "Welcome to real food," Roberto teased. "None of that five-star nonsense." Jonathan laughed too, wiping his hands. For once, the laughter didn't sting. It included him. As the meal wore on, he felt his guard lower. He asked questions about Tommy's wedding plans, about Maria's grandson, about Roberto's landlord battles. Their answers were filled with details: rent hikes, medical bills, second jobs that painted a picture of lives lived with grit and resilience. Jonathan realized how small his own complaints had been. He had once sulked over the wrong champagne at a party, or the inconvenience of a delayed flight to Paris. These people faced challenges daily that he had never even considered. Yet despite the struggles, their laughter was genuine, their bonds unshakable. Jonathan found himself envying them. When the bill arrived, Roberto reached for it out of habit, but Jonathan stopped him. "Let me—" Roberto raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Jonathan nodded. "Yeah, my treat." It wasn't about showing off. It was about gratitude for being included, for being allowed a seat at their table. Back at the office, Claire watched as they returned. Jonathan walking among them not as an outsider but as part of the group. He carried himself differently, lighter, more grounded, as though he had found something he hadn't known he was missing. From her office doorway, Claire allowed herself the smallest smile. She had doubted him, doubted he could last even a week. Yet here he was, not just surviving, but slowly, against all odds, belonging. That evening, as Jonathan walked home through the fading light, he thought of the laughter at the diner, the taste of a burger eaten with greasy fingers, the warmth of being thanked without expectation. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself, but for the first time, he wondered if perhaps it was the life he had always needed. The first whisper arrived on a Monday morning. Jonathan didn't hear it directly. At first, he only noticed the way conversations shifted when he walked past, the way glances lingered a little longer than usual. He shrugged it off as imagination until he saw Claire's face. She was in her office, speaking with a colleague. When Jonathan caught her expression, it was subtle. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes narrowed, but Jonathan had spent enough weeks under her scrutiny to recognize the difference. Something had unsettled her. The source appeared that afternoon in the form of Victoria Hale. She swept into the building like she owned it, heels clicking on the linoleum floor with a disdain that made the humble office seem beneath her. Tall, blonde, impeccably dressed in a designer coat, Victoria was everything Jonathan had once considered normal, and everything he was now beginning to see differently. "Jonathan!" she exclaimed, her voice carrying across the room. Heads turned. "Darling, there you are." Jonathan froze, the papers in his hand trembling slightly. "Victoria," he said, his voice low, wary. She closed the distance, air kissing his cheeks before anyone could process what was happening. "It's been ages. I heard the most ridiculous rumor that you were working here, but I suppose it's true." Her laugh rang out like glass breaking. Around them, co-workers exchanged looks, half curious, half cautious. Jonathan wished the floor would open and swallow him. Victoria leaned closer, her perfume heavy, her voice dripping with condescension. "Really, Jonathan, an office assistant, and under her supervision." Her gaze flicked toward Claire's closed office door. How quaint. "Victoria, not here," Jonathan hissed. But Victoria only smiled wider, her voice rising so others could hear. "Oh, don't worry. I understand perfectly. A little fling with the secretary to pass the time, to make your father think you're learning responsibility. It's almost charming." The words struck the room like poison. A few clerks stilled, others exchanged uneasy glances. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. "Stop it," he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "You don't know what you're talking about." Victoria tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Don't I? You've always been good at playing roles. Jonathan, this one suits you, pretending to care about ordinary people, but you and I both know it won't last." Before Jonathan could answer, Claire's office door opened. She stepped out, folder in hand, her expression carefully neutral, but Jonathan saw it, the flicker of hurt in her eyes. quickly masked by professionalism. "Miss Hale," Claire said coolly, "this is a workplace. If you have business here, please state it. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to leave." Victoria smirked. "Business. Oh, darling, my only business is with Jonathan, but I see he's in good hands." Her tone dripped venom as she cast Claire one final glance. "Enjoy your little project." With that, she turned on her heel and swept out, leaving silence in her wake. Jonathan felt every pair of eyes on him. He wanted to chase after Claire, to explain, to undo the damage. But Claire was already moving, her steps brisk, her face unreadable. She didn't look at him as she passed. The rest of the day was a blur. Jonathan went through the motions sorting files, answering phones, but his thoughts circled endlessly. He remembered the galas with Victoria, the champagne-fueled nights, the shallow laughter. Once, he had thought her dazzling. Now, he saw her clearly a mirror of the world he had come from, a world of appearances and cruelty. But Claire was the opposite, honest, steady, shaped by sacrifice. And now, thanks to Victoria, she believed the worst of him. That evening, as the office emptied, Jonathan gathered his courage and knocked on Claire's door. "Come in," she said. Her voice was calm, but distant. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Claire, about earlier." She didn't let him finish. "I don't want to discuss it. You should hear me out." Her eyes lifted to his, sharp and wounded. "Why?" "So you can tell me I'm just another distraction, that when this charade ends, you'll go back to your world and laugh about the time you played office with the secretary." Jonathan flinched. "No, that's not what this is." Claire shook her head, her composure cracking just slightly. "I've worked too hard, Jonathan. I've fought for every inch of respect I have. I won't let your past or your friends destroy that. I can't." Her words were final, like a door closing. Jonathan wanted to shout, to swear that she was wrong, but he saw the truth in her eyes. She had already been hurt too many times by people who thought of her as expendable. He left her office in silence, his chest tight, the hallway blurring as he walked out into the cold Boston evening. For the first time since starting this ordeal, he felt not just humbled, not just exhausted, but hollow, as though something precious had slipped from his hands before he'd even fully held it. That night, lying awake in his narrow bed, Jonathan realized that money, inheritance, even his father's approval meant little compared to the look of disappointment in Claire's eyes. And he feared that no matter how hard he worked, that look might never change. The tension lingered like smoke after a fire. For days, Jonathan noticed the change in Claire. She was still professional, still efficient, but her words carried a new distance, as though every sentence had been scrubbed clean of warmth. She no longer lingered at his desk with quiet corrections. She no longer allowed those fleeting glimmers of approval. She treated him like any other employee, and yet colder than she treated the rest. Jonathan tried to ignore it at first, convincing himself it was temporary. But the distance grew heavier with each passing hour, until finally, on a gray Thursday morning, he knocked on her office door. "Come in," she said, her tone flat. Jonathan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Claire sat at her desk, papers neatly arranged, her expression calm but guarded. "Claire," he began, "I need to talk about what happened with Victoria." Her pen didn't stop moving. "There's nothing to discuss." "Yes, there is," Jonathan pressed. "You think that she was telling the truth, that I'm here just to—" He faltered, the words catching, "that I'm using you finally." Claire set the pen down and looked at him. Her hazel eyes were sharp, but beneath them was something raw or hurt. "Jonathan, people like Victoria don't invent lies from nothing. She said what she said because it's believable, because it's exactly the kind of thing a man from your world would do." Her words landed like blows. Jonathan shook his head, desperate. "But that's not me anymore. Not here. Not with you." Claire rose from her chair, crossing her arms. "You don't see how this looks. Do you, an heir to a fortune, suddenly taking orders from a secretary? Whispers start. People assume I've traded my reputation for your attention. Do you know how hard I've worked to be taken seriously? Jonathan. How many doors were slammed in my face because I wasn't the right background, the right name, the right pedigree, and now, one rumor threatens to undo all of it. Jonathan's throat tightened. I would never let that happen to you. Claire's voice cracked, just slightly. You already did. By letting her walk in here. By letting your past spill into this world. Jonathan reached for words, but found none strong enough. He had never cared so much about anyone's opinion before. Now, the thought of Claire believing the worst of him was unbearable. Claire, please, he said softly. You're the only person who's ever seen me for who I could be, not who I was. I can't lose that. For a moment, her eyes softened, but then she turned away, shaking her head. That's exactly why we need distance. Whatever this is, whatever you think it could be, it's too dangerous. For me, for my career, for everything I've built. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice rising. So that's it. You'd rather believe her than me. Claire spun back, anger flashing through her calm exterior. This isn't about belief, Jonathan. It's about survival. My reputation is all I have. If it's ruined, there's no safety net, no inheritance to fall back on. Just nothing. Do you understand that her words silenced him? For the first time, Jonathan grasped the gulf between them. He had always lived with the comfort of a parachute no matter how far he fell. Money and name would catch him. Claire had none of that. One rumor could end everything she had fought for. She turned back to her desk, her voice lower now, resigned. I've already submitted a request for transfer. Another department, another branch if necessary. It's the only way to stop this from spreading. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Jonathan. A transfer. Yes, she said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled papers. This ends here. Jonathan's chest ached, a hollow ache he couldn't soothe. He had faced his father's cruelty, the humiliation of scrubbing floors, the exhaustion of endless days, but this was different. This was loss, real and cutting. He had never been afraid of losing money, parties, or even his father's approval. But the thought of losing Claire, losing the chance to prove himself to her, losing the one person who made him want to be more terrified him. Claire, he whispered, the fight gone from his voice. Don't do this. Please. Don't walk away. She didn't answer. She simply gathered her folder, tucked it under her arm, and walked past him toward the door. Her steps were steady, but Jonathan caught the glimmer of unshed tears in her eyes as she passed. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving him alone in the silence of her office. Jonathan sank into the chair opposite her desk, his hands gripping the armrests. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. Money couldn't fix this. Charm couldn't undo it. Even hard work seemed meaningless in the face of rumor and suspicion. What he wanted was simple: to be trusted, to be believed, to be worthy, and for the first time, he feared that no matter what he did, it might never be enough. That night, lying awake in his narrow bed, Jonathan wrestled with the hollow ache inside him. He had 30 days to prove himself to his father, but those 30 days no longer mattered. What mattered was Claire and the terrifying possibility that she was slipping beyond his reach. The days after Claire's announcement blurred together. Jonathan kept showing up to the office, but the rhythm he had begun to enjoy now felt hollow. He still answered phones, filed reports, carried boxes, but without her guidance, her quiet glances of approval. It all seemed meaningless. He tried to catch her in the hallways, to start a conversation, but she avoided him with professional ease. A nod here, a clipped word there, never rude, but distant, impenetrable. He felt like a ghost moving through the office, present but unseen, to fight the emptiness gnawing at him. Jonathan threw himself into the only thing left: work. He arrived before dawn, often the first to unlock the building. He stayed late, long after the others had gone home. He reorganized storage rooms, typed reports no one asked for, scrubbed surfaces until his hands burned. One night, Maria passed by on her way out and paused at the sight of him crouched on the floor, polishing the baseboards of the hallway. "Jonathan," she said softly, "you don't have to do this." He looked up, sweat dripping into his eyes. "I do." She wanted to press, but the look on his face silenced her. She left him there, the echo of his rag scrubbing against tile following her down the stairs. Jonathan kept at it until his fingers cracked, blisters splitting open until thin lines of blood stained the cloth. His palms, once soft from years of indulgence, were now raw and calloused. He stared at them one evening under the harsh office light hands that no longer belonged to the heir of Whitmore fortune, but to a man trying, failing, and still trying again. It was close to midnight when a voice broke the silence. "You've changed." Jonathan jerked his head up. Standing in the doorway was Edward Whitmore. His father looked strangely out of place in the cramped office hallway immaculate suit, silver hair perfectly combed, his presence commanding as ever. "Dad," Jonathan said, startled. "What are you doing here?" Edward stepped closer, his shoes clicking against the tile. He studied the rags, the bucket, the bloodied hands. For once, there was no sneer, no mocking tone, only a heavy, unreadable silence. "I've had you watched," Edward admitted at last. "I know how many hours you've been working. I know you've done double shifts. I know you've been breaking yourself to prove something." Jonathan bristled. "You wanted me to work. I'm working." Edward's gray eyes bored into him. "But why? That's what I came to ask." Jonathan swallowed hard. He wanted to say it was to win back Claire's trust, to silence the rumors, to prove he wasn't the failure his father always claimed. But the words stuck. "Those were reasons." "Yes, but not the reason." Edward's voice was low, unusually serious. "Jonathan, I don't care about the paperwork, the polished floors, the hours logged. I care about this. Are you willing to give up everything, every dollar, every privilege, every safety net for the thing you believe matters most?" Jonathan's breath caught. The question was simple, but it sliced through him like glass. For years, he had thought himself defined by what he owned, the circles he moved in, the power of his last name. But now, with bloodied hands and an empty heart, he knew the truth. None of it mattered, not without Claire. He pictured her face, the quiet strength in her eyes, the way she carried burdens without complaint. He remembered the night she told him about raising her sister, the dignity with which she bore every scar. He remembered how her smallest nod of approval filled him with more pride than his father's empire ever had. "Dad," Jonathan said finally, his voice hoarse. "If it means keeping her respect, yes. I'd give it all up. The inheritance, the company, everything." Edward studied him for a long, tense moment. Then, for the first time in Jonathan's memory, his father's stern expression wavered. There was no cruelty in his eyes, no cold judgment. Instead, there was something Jonathan had long thought impossible, a glimmer of respect. "You love her," Edward said quietly. Jonathan nodded. No hesitation. "I do. And it's not the kind of love I used to." The boardroom of Whitmore Industries was a place Jonathan had always hated. Its high ceilings, mahogany paneling, and gleaming brass fixtures were designed to inspire reverence. But for him, it felt suffocating. He had sat at this table countless times in his youth, dragged along to watch his father command the attention of the city's most powerful men and women. He had always felt like a child wearing a costume, waiting for a role he never believed he could play. Now, he entered the room not as an heir apparent, but as something stranger, an office assistant with calloused hands and blistered palms, carrying the weight of 30 days that had stripped him bare. The board members filed in, whispering among themselves. Some glanced at Jonathan with open disdain, others with curiosity. At the far end of the table sat Edward Whitmore, his expression as unreadable as always. Next to him, like a queen taking her throne, was Victoria Hale. She wore a cream silk dress that shimmered under the chandelier, her hair swept back into a perfect chignon. Her smile was as polished as the cut crystal water glasses before her. She looked at Jonathan like a cat sizing up prey. "Jonathan, She purred as he approached. "So glad you could join us. We were just discussing the future of Whitmore Industries and yours." Of course. Jonathan didn't sit. His hands, still raw from overtime shifts, rested on the back of the chair. He kept his eyes on his father. "What is this?" Edward's voice was steady, grave. "A proposal? Richard Hale has suggested a merger of our holdings, sealed by your marriage to his daughter. It would secure the company for the next generation." Jonathan's chest tightened. A merger. Through marriage, Victoria leaned forward, her eyes glinting. "Don't act surprised. Darling, you know how our world works. Families, fortunes, alliances. It's all very traditional. And really, isn't it time you embrace tradition?" Jonathan's stomach churned. He thought of Claire, her quiet strength, her sacrifices, the way she had looked at him with disappointment when the rumors spread. He thought of the diner lunches, the laughter he hadn't bought but earned. And then he looked at Victoria, polished, cruel, a relic of the world he had left behind. Edward's gaze never wavered. The board sees stability in this arrangement. But the decision, Jonathan, is yours. The words stunned him. His father had never allowed him choice in anything, not his education, not his career, not his future. And now, in the most public of forums, Edward was laying the choice bare. Jonathan's pulse hammered. He knew what was expected. If he agreed, the room would applaud, the merger would proceed, and his place as heir would be restored. All the humiliation of the past weeks would be swept away like a bad dream. But the thought sickened him. "Father," Jonathan said, his voice low but steady, "you told me 30 days, 30 days to prove myself. Was this the plan all along, to dress me up like a pawn and barter me off for shares and influence?" Gasps circled the table. No one spoke to Edward Whitmore like that. Edward's jaw tightened, but his voice was calm. "The question isn't whether you'll marry, Jonathan. The question is whether you understand what it means to sacrifice for something larger than yourself. Victoria offers certainty. She offers security. But if you believe in something else, now is the time to show it." Jonathan gripped the back of the chair harder, his knuckles white. The blisters on his hands throbbed, each ache a reminder of hours spent lifting boxes, scrubbing shelves, answering phones. Hours that had taught him what no gilded ballroom ever could. He looked around the table at the polished faces of the board, at Victoria's smug smile, at his father's steel-gray eyes. "I won't do it," Jonathan said at last. His voice was clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "I won't marry for profit. Not for you, not for anyone." Victoria's smile faltered. "Jonathan, don't be foolish. This is your legacy. Everything you've ever wanted." "No," Jonathan cut in, his voice rising. "It's everything you want. What I want." He hesitated, his throat tightening. "What I want is something real, something honest. Not this." Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, as if measuring the weight of his son's words. Jonathan took a step forward, his voice ringing louder now. "For weeks, I've lived a life I never thought I could. I've worked beside people who do more in a day than I used to do in a year. I've seen how hard they fight for their families, for their dignity, and I've learned that love, real love, doesn't come from deals and signatures. It comes from sacrifice." The boardroom was silent, stunned by the outburst. Jonathan turned toward Victoria, his expression hard. "You think you can buy me? You think you can shame the woman I care about into silence? But I won't let you. You don't own me, Victoria, and neither does my father." The words hung in the air, dangerous and liberating all at once. For the first time, Edward leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "So tell me, Jonathan, if not this path, then what? What are you willing to risk everything for?" Jonathan's answer came without hesitation. "For the truth, for the woman who makes me want to be better. For the chance to build a life worth living, even if it means giving up everything else." Edward studied him for a long, heavy moment. Then, slowly, He leaned back in his chair. His expression was unreadable, but Jonathan saw something flicker there, something he had never seen before. Respect. The storm had gathered. The next step would be to face it openly. Jonathan knew what he had to do. He would not hide behind secrecy or fear. If Claire was to believe him, if the world was to see who he had become, he would need to stand in the light, no matter the cost. The boardroom was already humming with tension when Victoria seized her moment. She stood, silk dress gleaming under the lights, her smile sharp as glass. "If Jonathan refuses me," she said, her voice cutting across the table, "then the board deserves to know why. He isn't rejecting a merger out of principle. He's throwing away his future over a secretary." Murmurs rippled through the room. Faces turned. Whispers rose like wind before a storm. Victoria's smile widened. "Yes, that's right. Claire Bennett, a woman who files papers, answers phones, and takes coffee orders. That's who Jonathan Whitmore claims to love. Is this the legacy you want for Whitmore Industries? To see its heir reduced to chasing after a common employee?" Jonathan's hands clenched at his sides. He could see the flicker of triumph in her eyes, the cruel delight she took in dragging Claire's name through the mud. Rage welled inside him, not the blind anger of spoiled pride, but the sharp, focused fury of a man watching something precious attacked. "Enough," Jonathan said. His voice carried, firm and steady, cutting through the rising whispers. He rose from his seat, every eye fixed on him. Victoria tilted her head, mocking. "Oh, going to defend your plaything." Jonathan looked straight at her, then at the board. "No, I'm going to tell you the truth. All of it." The room quieted, curiosity tightening the air. "For 32 years. I was exactly what you all think I am," Jonathan began. "Spoiled. Useless. A man who lived on his father's wealth and never lifted a finger for anyone else. And my father." He glanced at Edward, whose face remained carved from stone. "My father was done with it. He gave me 30 days. 30 days to prove I could survive as an ordinary man. 30 days, or he would give away every cent of my inheritance." Gasps rippled around the table. Board members exchanged stunned looks, some leaning forward in disbelief. Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger. "He stripped me of the Whitmore name. No credit cards, no cars, no staff. Just a job in the very company I was meant to inherit, an office assistant under the supervision of Claire Bennett." He paused, letting the words sink in. His chest tightened as he looked around the table, at the shocked and judgmental faces. "At first, I hated it. I thought it was beneath me. I stumbled. I failed. I spilled coffee, jammed copiers, dropped boxes. I was humiliated. And for the first time in my life, I began to understand what it means to work, what it means to earn." His voice softened, heavy with memory. "I watched people like Maria, who keeps working even though her back aches from years of lifting. Roberto, who fights every month to pay rent. Claire, who gave up her own dreams to raise her sister when their parents died. I saw people carrying burdens I could never imagine, and doing it with dignity. They didn't laugh at my failures. They showed me what real strength looks like." Victoria rolled her eyes, but Jonathan pressed on. "And Claire." His throat tightened, but he forced the words. "Claire was harder on me than anyone. She refused to give me special treatment, refused to be impressed by my name. She taught me that respect isn't given because of a title. It's earned, box by box, hour by hour, day by day." And somewhere in those 30 days, I realized something I never expected. I fell in love with her, not because of what she could give me, but because she showed me the kind of person I want to become. A hush fell over the room. Even the most skeptical board members leaned in, caught in the rawness of his words. Victoria's voice sliced the silence. "This is pathetic. You're ready to throw away billions of dollars for a woman who scrubs floors." Jonathan turned on her, his voice ringing with a conviction he had never known before. "Yes, because those billions mean nothing if I go back to the man I was. That man was hollow, selfish, worthless. I would rather have nothing and be worthy of Claire than have everything and be the fraud I used to be. The room erupted in gasps. Edward's eyes narrowed, but Jonathan didn't stop. I renounce it, Jonathan declared, his voice steady and unflinching. The trust fund, the inheritance, the legacy, I don't want it, not if it means selling my soul. From this day forward, I'll build my own life, with my own hands. The words hung in the air like thunder. Silence followed, long and heavy. Victoria's face drained of color, her perfect composure cracking. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Finally, Edward broke the silence. His voice was low, but it carried through the room. So, you choose her over the fortune. Jonathan met his father's gaze. I choose her. I choose the man she made me want to be. And if that costs me everything else, so be it. Edward studied him for a long, unreadable moment. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, Edward leaned back in his chair, a faint glint in his steel-gray eyes, something Jonathan had never seen before. Respect. Victoria, however, could not hide her fury. She gathered her purse with trembling hands, her smile twisted with rage. You'll regret this, Jonathan. You'll regret throwing everything away for a secretary. Jonathan's answer was calm, almost gentle. No. For the first time in my life, I won't. As Victoria stormed out, the board sat stunned, the echoes of Jonathan's words reverberating off the mahogany walls. For Jonathan, the storm had finally broken, but in the wreckage, he felt something he hadn't in years' freedom. The boardroom still hummed with the echo of Jonathan's declaration. Victoria's exit had left behind a trail of whispers, the kind that clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Jonathan stood in the center, his chest rising and falling, his palms raw and stinging but steady. Then the door opened. Claire Bennett stepped inside. She hadn't meant to. Not really. She'd been delivering a set of reports to another department when she heard the raised voices, the sharp tones of argument echoing down the marble corridor. Against her better judgment, she had followed the sound, and now here she was, framed in the doorway, with every pair of eyes turning toward her. Her breath caught. Jonathan stood tall in the center of the room, not in a tailored suit, but in the simple work clothes he'd worn every day for weeks. His shirt sleeves were rolled, revealing hands marked with calluses and bandaged blisters. He looked nothing like the pampered heir she had once dismissed. And yet, in that moment, he had never looked more like a man. Claire, Jonathan said softly, his voice carrying even in the silence. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to turn, to retreat, to protect herself, but her feet wouldn't move. Jonathan turned fully toward her, his expression open and vulnerable. There's something I haven't told you, not because I wanted to lie, but because I was afraid you'd see me as the man I used to be. Claire's throat tightened. Around the table, board members shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they were witnessing business or something far more intimate. Jonathan's voice grew stronger. My father gave me an ultimatum: 30 days to prove I wasn't worthless. 30 days to survive without wealth, without privilege. If I failed, everything would go to charity. He paused, his gaze locked on hers. That's why I came to work under you. Not to play a game, not to use you, but because it was the only chance I had left. Claire felt the sting of tears but forced herself to remain composed. And what did you prove? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan took a step closer. That I've wasted most of my life, that I was selfish, shallow, blind, but more importantly, his voice cracked, then steadied again, that I don't need an inheritance to know what matters. I don't need board approval, or family money, or anyone's applause. All I need is you. Gasps circled the table. Claire froze, her heart hammering. Jonathan reached into his pocket. From it, he pulled a small box, worn and modest. He opened it to reveal a simple silver ring plain, unadorned, glinting softly under the chandelier. This, Jonathan said, holding it up for all to see, I bought with my first paycheck. My own money. It isn't much, but it's honest. And it's the truest thing I've ever offered anyone. Claire's breath hitched. The room blurred at the edges, the faces of the board fading until there was only Jonathan raw, unpolished, and impossibly sincere. He sank to one knee, right there on the polished wood floor. "Claire Bennett," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I love you. I love your strength, your compassion, your integrity. I love the way you've pushed me, challenged me, refused to let me hide behind excuses. You made me want to be a better man, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. Will you marry me?" The room held its breath. Claire's world tilted. Her mind screamed of risk, of the scandal, of the whispers that would follow, of the career she had fought to protect. But her heart had been betraying her for weeks, softening against her will, finding warmth in his stubborn persistence and unexpected humility. She looked at Jonathan kneeling, vulnerable, offering her not power, not luxury, but a life built on something real, and she felt the walls she had built begin to crumble. Tears filled her eyes. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you don't know what you're asking. This could destroy everything." Jonathan shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "No, it could build everything. Not the life my father planned, not the legacy this board expects. Something better, something ours." Her breath shuddered. Her entire life had been sacrifice, every step measured, every choice weighed for survival. She had never allowed herself the luxury of choosing for her heart. And yet, here was a man who had given up the world for her. The boardroom was silent, the air electric. Finally, Claire's lips curved into the faintest, trembling smile. She dropped to her knees before him, her hands cupping his battered ones. "You're a fool," she whispered, tears spilling freely now. "A magnificent, impossible fool." "Yes," Jonathan said, smiling through his own tears. "But you're fool if you'll have me." Her answer came in the softest word, but it struck like thunder. "Yes." The room erupted not in applause, not at first, but in stunned murmurs. Edward Whitmore rose slowly from his chair, his eyes locked on the two figures kneeling in the center of the boardroom. For the first time in Jonathan's life, his father did not look at him with disappointment, but with something else entirely. Pride. Jonathan slid the ring onto Claire's finger. It was too simple for the grandeur of the setting, too modest for the expectations of the family name. But on her hand, it gleamed brighter than any diamond. He pulled her into his arms, their kiss sealing the promise not just before each other, but before everyone who had doubted, judged, or mocked. And in that moment, surrounded by power brokers and polished mahogany, Jonathan Whitmore and Claire Bennett built something stronger than any empire. They built the truth. The boardroom still vibrated with the shock of what had just transpired. Jonathan knelt with Claire's hand in his, the simple silver ring catching the light like a quiet defiance against centuries of tradition. Around them, the most powerful men and women in Boston shifted uncomfortably, whispering into one another's ears. At the far end of the table, Edward Whitmore rose to his feet. The movement was slow, deliberate, and it commanded silence. For decades, Edward's presence had been enough to still a room, but never before had Jonathan wondered which version of his father would speak, the cold, disapproving patriarch or someone else. His father's gaze moved first to Claire, then back to him, and then unbelievably, impossibly, Edward smiled. It was not wide or warm, but it was real, and it softened the steel lines of his face. "My son," Edward said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and something gentler beneath. "For the first time in your life, you are your own man." Jonathan's breath caught. He had prepared himself for fury, for rejection, even for the final severing of ties, but not for pride, never for pride. Edward turned to the board, his expression sharp again. "You've all just witnessed what I've been hoping for years, that Jonathan Whitmore would choose principle over privilege, that he would fight not for money, but for meaning." He gestured toward Claire. And in choosing her, he's proven what none of us could teach him: integrity. A murmur spread around the table. Some board members exchanged skeptical looks. Others nodded slowly, begrudgingly persuaded. Victoria Hale, however, shot to her feet, her face pale with rage. This is madness. You would throw away a merger worth billions for this farce. Edward's eyes cut to her like blades. Miss Hale, I believe your time here is finished. Your family's proposal is no longer under consideration. You can't be serious, she snapped. I am. His voice was cold, final. Take your leave. Her father, Richard Hale, sputtered protests from his seat, but the tide had shifted. One by one, board members leaned back, distancing themselves from the Hales. Victoria's composure cracked. For once, her smile failed her. With a furious glare at Jonathan and Claire, she stormed from the room, her heels clattering like gunfire on the marble floor. The door closed behind her, and silence settled again. Edward looked at Jonathan once more. You renounced your inheritance. I intend to honor that decision. From this day forward, you'll start where every other employee does, at the bottom. No titles, no shortcuts. You'll earn your place, Jonathan, with hard work and perseverance. Jonathan nodded, his chest swelling with something he had never felt before: gratitude for a challenge. That's all I want, he said quietly. Edward's gaze flicked to Claire. For the first time, his voice softened. And as for you, Miss Bennet, welcome to this family. Should you still wish it, you've done what I could not. You've made my son into a man. Claire's cheeks flushed, but she lifted her chin with quiet dignity. With respect, Mr. Whitmore, Jonathan made himself into one. I only refused to let him quit. A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the room. Even Edward allowed the faintest smirk. Then perhaps you're exactly the partner he needs. The meeting adjourned soon after. Though its echoes would linger in Boston social circles for months to come, the Hales retreated in disgrace. The board, though unsettled, found itself grudgingly impressed by Jonathan's defiance, and Jonathan himself walked out of the towering Whitmore building hand in hand with Claire, not as an heir, not as a failure, but as a man beginning anew. The weeks that followed were not glamorous. Jonathan traded his penthouse for a modest apartment in a brick building near the harbor. The place smelled faintly of old wood and sea air, with creaky floors and a radiator that rattled at night. For the first time, he paid bills with money. He had earned money that came from long days spent filing, answering phones, and learning the humdrum rhythms of the office. Claire stood beside him through it all. She remained his supervisor on paper, but their relationship grew into something deeper, steadier. They spoke openly, sometimes arguing fiercely, but always returning to the truth that had bound them together: honesty. There were nights when Jonathan's hands ached, when exhaustion pressed heavy on his shoulders, when he doubted himself. On those nights, Claire would remind him with a quiet smile, "You're not who you were, and that's enough." Jonathan found strength in small victories. The first time a colleague thanked him sincerely for his help. The first time he finished a week without error. The first time Claire looked at him not with skepticism, but with pride. And slowly, brick by brick, he built the foundation of a new life. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't power. It was better. One Friday evening, after another long week, Jonathan stood by the harbor with Claire, watching the sunset bleed gold across the water. He slipped his arm around her shoulders, the cool breeze tangling her hair. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Regret what? Walking away from everything?" The house, the cars, the inheritance. Jonathan considered the question, then shook his head. "No, for the first time, I feel like what I have is mine, earned, real." He looked at her, his voice tender. "Besides, what I gained is worth more than all of it." Her eyes softened, and she leaned into him. "You're learning," she teased gently. "I had the best teacher," he said. They stood in silence, watching the last light fade. Behind them, the city bustled. Ahead of them, The waves whispered promises of change, and between them, something stronger than any fortune grew trust. It was not an empire, not yet, but it was a foundation, and that was enough. 6 months later, Boston stirred awake under a pale spring dawn. The city was quieter than usual, its streets washed in the faint glow of street lamps not yet extinguished, its skyline kissed by the first soft blush of sunrise. On the rooftop of Whitmore Industries, two figures stood together, the chill breeze tugging at their jackets, their hands entwined. Jonathan Whitmore and Claire Bennett looked out over the city, silent but content. Jonathan's hair was longer now, his once polished style replaced by something more relaxed, more natural. The expensive suits of his past had been traded for practical clothes still neat, but marked by a life lived with purpose rather than pretense. The lines in his hands had deepened, not from idleness, but from effort, each callus a badge of proof that he had earned his place. Claire stood beside him, her posture as steady as ever, her hazel eyes reflecting both the morning light and the weight of her journey. The months had changed her too. No longer the solitary guardian of her own fragile reputation, she carried herself with the assurance of someone whose worth was no longer questioned. Within the company, she was now Director of Human Resources, respected for her fairness, admired for her clarity, and trusted for her wisdom. Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. "Do you remember," he said with a smile, "when I couldn't even make a cup of coffee without spilling half of it?" Claire laughed softly, the sound carrying on the wind. "I remember thinking you'd never last a week, and now look at you." He smiled sheepishly. "A project manager with his own team. And not just any team," she added. "They actually like you." Jonathan chuckled, but beneath the humor was quiet pride. He had started at the bottom sorting files, running errands, learning humility in every menial task. Over the months, his persistence, his willingness to listen, and his newfound respect for the people around him had earned him something no inheritance ever could trust. When the opportunity came to lead a small logistics project, the team had voted to have him in charge. It was a modest role, but to Jonathan, it was more valuable than any title he had once taken for granted. "They like me," Jonathan echoed, shaking his head. "That means more than I ever imagined it would." Claire rested her head against his shoulder. "That's because you stopped trying to impress them and started working alongside them. That's leadership." For a long moment, they stood in silence, watching the first rays of sunlight stretch across the Charles River, painting the water in streaks of gold. The city seemed reborn in that light, its imperfections softened, its possibilities endless. Jonathan exhaled deeply, his breath fogging in the morning air. "You know, 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. No money, no safety net, nothing to fall back on. And now—" He trailed off, looking at Claire. "Now," she prompted gently. "Now I realize it was the beginning of something real. Something I never would have found if my father hadn't stripped everything away." Claire smiled, her fingers tightening around his. "Edward Whitmore may be many things, but he gave you a gift, even if it was the harshest one." Jonathan nodded slowly. "And he gave me you. Though, to be fair, you almost didn't let me have that either." Claire laughed again, though her eyes shimmered with warmth. "You had to earn it, and I'll keep earning it," he said firmly. "Every day." The sincerity in his voice silenced her laughter, replacing it with something deeper. She leaned closer, her lips brushing his cheek. "I know you will." Below them, the city awakened delivery trucks rumbling through narrow streets, pedestrians hurrying with steaming cups of coffee, the hum of another day beginning. To Jonathan, it was no longer just noise. It was the sound of life, messy, imperfect, but real. He thought of his former friends, still trapped in gilded cages of wealth, their lives measured in parties and deals. Once, he would have envied them. Now, he pitied them. They would never know the satisfaction of earning a paycheck, the pride of finishing a hard day's work, the warmth of being valued not for a last name but for effort. Most of all, They would never know the miracle of standing hand in hand with someone who loved them for who they had become, not what they had inherited. Claire lifted her face to the rising sun. Funny, isn't it, she mused. We spend so much time chasing security, chasing approval, and all along, the real wealth was right here. She touched her chest, then Jonathan's, in who we are, in who we choose to love. Jonathan kissed her forehead, his voice quiet but certain. You're my true inheritance, Claire. Everything else was just noise. Tears pricked her eyes, but she didn't look away. She had lived through years of sacrifice, through loss and struggle, through the relentless demand to survive, and now, standing on this rooftop, she knew those years had led her here to a love that wasn't gilded, wasn't fragile, but strong, steady, and real. Together, they watched as the sun climbed higher, spilling light over the city, over the company, over their future. It wasn't perfect. Challenges still lay ahead, but whatever came, they would face it together, hand in hand. They turned from the sunrise and walked back toward the stairwell, ready to descend into the life they were building, not from inherited wealth, not from privilege, but from the strength of their character and the depth of their love. And as they stepped into the day, the truth of their journey lingered like the glow of the dawn. Fortunes can fade, names can be forgotten, but love and integrity, those endure. At its heart, Jonathan and Claire's story reminds us of something we often forget. Wealth can be inherited, but character must be built. Too often, society measures worth by titles, possessions, or the family name we carry. Yet the true measure of a life is found in how we treat others, the work we're willing to do with our own hands, and the love we choose to nurture. For Jonathan, losing everything was the very thing that allowed him to discover what mattered most. And for Claire, protecting her integrity meant holding fast to her values, even when it came at a cost. Together, their journey teaches us that dignity lies not in comfort, but in courage. No matter our age or station, we are never too old to change, to grow, or to choose love over pride. In the end, our legacy is not what we leave in bank accounts, but what we leave in people's hearts. Thank you so much for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with friends and loved ones, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. Until next time, may your days be filled with hope, love, and light.